effects of cigarette smoking on anesthesia, this is very important, okay? First thing, we'll see the effect. We have to know all the effects on the systems, all right? So the first is going to be on the cardiovascular system. So now what happens is that there is nicotine and there is carbon monoxide, right? So nicotine is what is entering the body because of cigarette smoke. Plus carbon monoxide also particles enter the body, right? So first we'll see nicotine, then we'll see the effects of carbon monoxide. So when nicotine, what does it do? It stimulates the adrenal medulla. Okay. What happens because of adrenal medulla stimulation? There is release of adrenaline, right? This release of adrenaline, it causes increase in the sympathetic tone. Sympathetic tone of what? Of the blood vessel, right? Plus it also resets the carotid. Okay, it's visible, right? So it will reset the carotid body and aortic receptors for a higher BP, for a high, So basically what happens is receptors, these are the ones, right, which are sending the signals to the cardiovascular center, right, in the medulla, and accordingly altering, the tone of the blood vessels. So these get set for a higher blood pressure levels. Now, ultimately, what is going to happen? So ultimately, there's going to be increase in the systolic BP, increase in the diastolic BP, increase in the heart rate, right? Next, what's going to happen? There's going to be increase in the peripheral vascular resistance, obviously because of increased sympathetic tone, right? Then there's going to be increase in the myocardial. There's increase in the myocardial contractility, okay, because of nicotine. What is this causing? This is leading to increase in the myocardial oxygen demand. So there's increase in the myocardial O2 demand, correct? But at the same time, there's going to be coronary vasoconstriction also. So there's going to be increase in the coronary vascular resistance. Now, what is going to happen with the coronary vascular resistance is going to increase? It's going to be decrease in the coronary blood flow. Now, what has happened because of this? Because of the increase in the demand has increased, supply has decreased. There's a demand-supply mismatch which occurs in these patients. All right. Then, so this is, I hope understood, right? The effect of nicotine. Now, what is the half-life of nicotine? Okay. So, how long does this nicotine have its pressor effect, like the sympathetic tone effect? How long can it cause this release of adrenaline in our body? So, the half-life of this nicotine is 30 to 60 minutes. All right. The half-life is 30 to 60 minutes. And after the patient has smoked one cigarette, how long will this effect last? All these effects, how long will it last after taking one cigarette? So it will last for only 30 minutes. Okay, it will last for 30 minutes. So how much time we want that the patient should at least not smoke, because we don't want the effects of nicotine? At least 3 to 4 hours abstinence. Okay. So if there is 3 to 4 hours of abstinence, then these pressor effects of nicotine will be after 3 to 4 hours, you will not see all these effects on the patient's body. Okay. Next, we'll see the effects of carbon monoxide. Okay. So remember, your half-life is around half an hour to 1 hour. And after abstinence, the effects are gone after 3 to 4 hours. All right. Cigarette smoke has got how much carbon monoxide? Okay. So it has got 400 part per million carbon monoxide is present in cigarette smoke. Okay. What does carbon monoxide do? It binds to the hemoglobin and forms carboxyhemoglobin. What does this carboxyhemoglobin? Carboxyhemoglobin has 200 times more affinity. So basically, carbon monoxide, I'll write it in a separate line. So we know that carbon monoxide has got a lot of affinity for hemoglobin, right? So carbon monoxide has got 200 times more affinity for hemoglobin compared to what? Compared to oxygen. All right. Because of this, what is going to happen? Carboxyhemoglobin is not going to allow oxygen to bind to hemoglobin. So overall, what has happened? The overall oxygen carrying capacity of blood has gone down. Okay. Then what is going to happen to the HB oxygen dissociation curve? So this curve is going to have a leftward shift. There's going to be a So this curve, if you remember, this curve is going to have a leftward shift. Okay. Which means what? That oxygen offloading to the tissues is going to be the oxygen offloading to tissues is decreased, right? Now, this is going to cause what? Tissue hypoxia. Correct. There's going to be tissue hypoxia. So, next, this chronic tissue hypoxia is going to be compensated how? By erythropoiesis, which I mean what? There's going to be increase in the hematocrit. So that is, I mean to say increase in the RBCs. Okay. And this increase in the RBC is going to cause what? Increase in the blood viscosity. Okay. So this is what has happened. Now blood viscosity has increased in these patients. Increase in blood viscosity makes the patient prone for thromboembolism. Correct. So now we know the patient is prone for thromboembolism. We already know that this patient was prone for having myocardial oxygen demand, that there's a mismatch, right? And there's going to be chronic tissue hypoxia. Is the hypoxia only for other tissues and not heart? No, there is myocardial hypoxia also, right? So overall, this patient has got increased risk for what? Coronary artery disease. So ultimately, the patient is at risk for coronary artery disease because of tissue hypoxia. That is also myocardial hypoxia included in that. Plus, there is going to be a mismatch of oxygen and myocardial oxygen demand and the coronary supply, and the patient becomes prone to thromboembolism. All right. So that's why it's prone for coronary artery disease. So now the half-life of this carbon monoxide. So as I told you, the half-life of nicotine was how much? It was 30 minutes to 60 minutes, right? The half-life of carbon monoxide, it depends on minute ventilation. So carbon monoxide half-life, it depends upon the minute ventilation of this patient. There is no fixed value. It keeps changing. So the patient is sleeping. Let's say he's sleeping, he's at rest, or he is, awake. All right. So let's see how much is the half-life. Okay. So the half-life will be different. When he's sleeping, the half-life is 10 hours. It takes so long. Okay. If he's at rest, the half-life, it is 4 to 6 hours. And if he is doing some activity, it is 1 hour, which means what? At all these points, the minute ventilation is different, right? Minute ventilation is the least over here. It is the maximum over here. Therefore, it took lesser time. Meaning carbon monoxide half-life depends upon minute ventilation, not like nicotine, which has got a fixed value. Okay. Then how can I speed up if the patient has come? I want to quickly get the carbon monoxide out of his body. So if I give a 100% FiO2, okay, to the patient, so what is the half-life? It is 40 to 80 minutes. Okay. If I give hyperbaric oxygen therapy to this patient, my half-life is really less. It is only 23 minutes. Okay. What was actually happening in this minute ventilation? It was basically, it was actually more than minute ventilation, more that oxygen reaching, in the body in that 1 minute. So basically, this is that only, that more oxygen you will give, faster the carbon monoxide will be removed out of the body. Okay. Next, we need to know what is the effect on the respiratory system. We have already, gone through these points before. So there's going to be increase in the mucus production, right? There is going to be the mucociliary clearance. The mucociliary clearance is going to be less. Why? Because of celiotoxins. Okay, so basically why? Because the ciliary function is impaired. Why is it impaired? Because there are celiotoxins which are released. Okay, so cilia is supposed to beat upwards and remove all the secretions, right? But that's not happening because the cilia is destroyed because of celiotoxins. All right. Then there's going to be increased airway reactivity. What do I mean by airway reactivity? Means the airway is very sensitive. So patient will very easily have laryngo or bronchospasm. All right. So increased airway reactivity. Next, what is happening? That the epithelial lining of the airway is destroyed. So there is destruction of the epithelial lining. So what's going to happen if the epithelial lining of the airways is destroyed? It means these noxious particles which are there, okay? The noxious particles of what? Of smoke, right? Because it's a smoker. Of smoke will enter in. So it will enter into the airways, into the, airway parenchyma. And then it's going to cause, increased reactivity of the airway, makes the patient again more prone for bronchospasm, laryngospasm. All right. Then there's going to be decrease in the surfactant. Okay. And there's going to be loss of elastic recoil, which we have already seen, of lung. Now, why is this occurring? Because of the enzymes. Okay. So there are going to be elastases. So because of enzyme, elastolytic enzymes. So elastolytic enzymes are going to cause, loss of elastic recoil of the lung. Your ciliatoxins are there. They're going to destroy the ciliary function. Okay. So this is what's going to happen. And the patient is also going to be prone for lung infections. Not to forget, all of this is ultimately going to land up, the patient is going to land up with lung infections. Now, after stopping smoking, how much time does it take for everything to come back to normal? Okay. So we'll see that. The one to return to normal, which is going to be the ciliary activity, the beating of the cilia, it's going to take 4 to 6 days. Okay, next is the airway reactivity. So this is also going to take approximately 1 week, 5 to 10 days. So these are almost close. All right. Then the next thing, the secretions. When will the sputum or the secretions become, normal? Because these patients have got more amount of sputum secretion. So how much time is this going to take? It's going to take 2 to 6 weeks. Okay. And the longest time that is taken is going to be for the tracheobronchial clearance. So this clearance to reach its normal value is going to take at least 3 months. Okay. So this is again important that you should know. Okay. The next is going to be effect on the GIT. So we'll just quickly discuss that. So on the GIT, so what it is said that when the patient smokes, the lower esophageal sphincter, which is there, it relaxes. Okay. Because of which there can be regurgitation and aspiration. But the most important point is that this is a temporary thing. Okay. So when does this start? So if the patient has smoked, 4 minutes after he has smoked, this sphincter relaxes. When does the sphincter gain its tone back? After 8 minutes. Okay. So after he has completed smoking, once he has completed smoking, after that 8 minutes, after that, the tone will come back. So is it that your patient is just smoking outside in the, pre-op area and coming on the table? No, right? So there is no such risk for aspiration. Many places it's written there's a risk for aspiration, but there is no risk of aspiration. Okay. Then the risk of post-operative nausea, vomiting. So post-operative nausea, vomiting is reduced in smokers. Okay. What is the effect on the immune system? Immunity is low. Okay. So the patient is prone for infections. Then effect on the renal system. There's going to be increase in the ADH, antidiuretic hormone. Okay. Which is going to cause dilutional hyponatremia, antidiuretic hormone. All right. So diuresis will not occur, right? And there will be hyponatremia. Okay. Then the patient, what is the effect on pain? So smokers have got very low pain tolerance. So you have to give them really good analgesia. So in the pre-op area, how are you going to prepare the COPD patient for whatever surgery he comes for? First thing, pre-op, tell him to stop smoking. Okay. We already know 4 to 8 weeks is very good, but if not possible, as soon as if it's an emergency surgery, you can have no option. But if it's an elective surgery, please tell him to stop smoking at least 4 to 8 weeks before the elective surgery. All right. Then treat all his infections. We know low immunity, prone to infections, treat the infections. All right. Then hydration. We know a lot of mucus, a lot of secretions that the patient is going to have in his airway, right? We don't want them to be very thick and viscous. It should be very easy to clear out, right? So you're going to tell the patient good hydration is very essential. Okay. Next, if this patient is receiving oxygen, then you will give humidification. Humidification will again help to reduce the viscosity of the secretions. All right. Then you will give mucolytics. Again, this will break down the thick secretions. Okay. Postural drainage. Okay. So whatever secretions have been collected with the help of a physiotherapist, you can do postural drainage of these secretions. Okay. Then there is going to be vigorous coughing, which will help to remove the secretions. Chest percussions, again, for the same reason. Deep breathing breathing exercises in center spirometry. Why? Because we want to reduce the post-op pulmonary complications. All right. If the patient is having wheezing, what will you give? You'll give bronchodilator therapy. All right. What bronchodilator will you give? Beta 2 agonists will be given. Right. So you have got beta 2 agonists, you got the phosphodiesterase inhibitor drugs, you got steroids. Okay. Then what about the intraoperative part? Now we already optimized the patient preoperatively. Intraoperatively, ensure that you have all the standard ASA monitors, which is what the non-invasive BP, ECG, right? Then you have the saturation probe, temperature probe, correct? And then you have the ATCO2. So these have to be there. Okay. Try to do a baseline EBG as far as possible because you will know what is his baseline PaO2 and PaCO2. All right. You are an anesthetist. You can decide whether you want to go regional or GA. Make the right choice. Try to use regional as far as possible. Okay. In case you have no option and you have to give GA, what do you do in GA? Pre-oxygenate. So pre-oxygenate the patient well, right? After pre-oxygenation comes induction, right? So what kind of drugs will you use for induction? You will not use long-acting drugs. So you will use shorter-acting drugs. You will prefer to use shorter-acting opioids, shorter-acting muscle relaxants, okay? You will try to keep neuromuscular monitoring ready. Why? Because I want to prevent post-op pulmonary complications, okay? Then I will take all the steps I can to prevent laryngospasm or bronchospasm when I'm manipulating the airway. After induction comes intubation or insertion of the supraglottic airway device, right? So you want to prevent any kind of response where there is a laryngospasm or bronchospasm, right? What will you do? So for that, you have to ensure a very deep plane of anesthesia, adequate relaxation. There should be adequate analgesia, correct? There has to be, you can also give IV lignocaine to prevent a response. Okay. So then the next thing, if you're using inhalation agents at the time of induction, suppose, you're giving IV plus inhalation induction. Inhalation induction, don't use irritant, volatile agents, use sevoflurane, preferable, right? Then during the intraoperative, now intraoperative maintenance, right? So maintenance with volatile agents. So volatile agents, again, don't use irritant volatile agents. Use shorter acting volatile agents. Use sevoflurane, desflurane, shorter acting. Don't use longer acting ones, okay? Why am I saying this? Because we know that these patients are prone for air trapping. If there is exhaled air is not able to, there's incomplete exhalation, there is going to be exhaled air trapped inside. That air which is trapped inside, that gas which is trapped inside, which you are giving through the ventilator, that is going to contain what? It's going to contain some oxygen, some air, and maybe some sevoflurane if that's your combination. Or maybe you're using oxygen and you're using nitrous, and you're using desflurane. So that trapping that is occurring, some desflurane is also trapped inside. Some sevoflurane is also trapped inside. What is that going to cause? That trapping is going to delay your recovery at the end of surgery. Okay. So if there is a risk of this, if you suspect trapping is going to occur, what you can do? You can do TIVA, right? So you can give IV infusion of propofol and you can maintain the general anesthesia, okay, intraoperatively. Then if the patient has bulle, as I told you in the chest X-ray, you might find bulle. Bulle are what? Air-filled spaces, right? So then don't use nitrous if you have seen a bulle in the pre-op X-ray. All right. So then if during the case, if you want to prevent drying up of secretions, right, you want to ensure that there's humidification of the gas that the patient is receiving. So you have to place an HME filter, very essential. All right. Then you have to use controlled mechanical ventilation, already told you, right? So you have to use lung protective ventilation strategies, low tidal volume. PEEP has to be 0 to 5. Don't use very high PEEP. Okay. Ensure that your respiratory rate is not too high. A very high respiratory rate will not allow adequate exhalation to occur and it will cause air trapping. So respiratory rate should be between 6 to 10 per minute. 6 to 10 per minute should be the respiratory rate so that expiration can be completed. That if intraoperatively the patient is having air trapping. Now I told you COPD patients are prone for air trapping. So how would we know? What is air trapping? It generates auto PEEP in the patient. So how would I know that my patient is generating auto PEEP? So you will come to know in terms of the cardiac status of the patient. So basically there'll be hypotension. You will see hypotension. Okay, in a COPD patient, if all of a sudden during the surgery, you see, okay, hypotension has started occurring, there is no such blood loss happening. Why is this hypotension occurring? I have not given any drug which is, going to cause hypotension. My MAC is also fine. I'm not giving too much of volatile agents. You've ruled out everything for hypotension. Then you can suspect, okay, auto PEEP might have happened. So how did you come to a definitive diagnosis that this is because of auto PEEP? you will disconnect the ventilator from the patient. Disconnect the tubing. Disconnect it for 30 seconds. Okay. After disconnecting for 30 seconds, what's going to happen in those 30 seconds? There's going to be a release of the trapped air inside. All right. Then you reattach the ventilator and let ventilation occur. What you will notice is that the hemodynamics will improve of the patient. You have reached the diagnosis that yes, there was autopeep in this patient. All right. So that's one way that you can diagnose that you can identify air trapping has occurred. The other thing is capnography. So you will see that the EtCO2 will not come to the baseline. The EtCO2 will never touch the baseline. That means there is retention, air trapping is there. Okay. The next, even the expiratory flow graph, which is there, expiratory flow is not reaching the baseline. So capno is not reaching the baseline. Expiratory flow is also not reaching the baseline. Then another thing, you can measure the PEEP. Okay, so there are some ventilators where you can give a expiratory hold. There is an expiratory hold option. So when that expiratory hold option is pressed, the PEEP value is calculated. And that is when you come to know, okay, that this is the PEEP. So you can come to know, okay, auto PEEP is there or not there. Okay. So these are the ways that you can know whether air trapping is occurring or not. All right. Now it's the time to extubate this patient. So now what will you do? You will prefer to do deep extubation. You don't want the patient to have any kind of response. Again, why? Because we're afraid of laryngospasm, bronchospasm. Airway is very reactive. It will very easily go into laryngospasm, bronchospasm. So we prefer to go for deep extubation. All right. And next after this is, and very important, I forgot to tell you. So whatever drugs you are using, please don't use drugs that will cause histamine release. So you know what are the drugs that cause histamine release, all right, that we're using in daily practice. So you've got thiopentones, you've got atracurium, right? So these are the main currently that we're using in daily practice, which are prone for causing histamine release. So please don't use any such drug, because again, that will cause can make the patient prone towards bronchospasm. Now we are done. Now we've reached the post-op period. Okay. So in the post-op, what will I do? I'll give the patient propped up. Okay. If required, I can give the patient CPAP if needed. If I think it's necessary, I can give the patient high flow nasal oxygen if I think it's necessary that time. After the surgery, you have to tell the patient to cough very well. You have to ensure that he's removing his secretions well. Okay. You have to ensure that lung expansion maneuvers are continued in the post-op period. Okay. So again, I will repeat: deep breathing exercises, incentive spirometry, you got chest physiotherapy. All right. So you have to continue these lung expansion techniques. Now, you have to do early mobilization of the patient. You don't want him lying on the bed, right? The earlier he mobilizes, it's better. So to do all this, what is important from our part as an anesthetist? Lung expansion and all the physiotherapists will manage, right? And so what are we supposed to do? We are supposed to give very good analgesia to this patient. If the patient doesn't have analgesia, he's going to have so much pain. He's not going to cough. He's not going to do any chest physiotherapy. He's not going to mobilize. So you have to give good analgesia. Now, this analgesia you want to give, you will prefer to give nerve blocks. You will prefer to give epidural, if possible, if it's an open abdominal surgery. Epidural, you will prefer to give opioids versus giving a local anesthetic. So if I have to give something, I will give an opioid in the epidural. I will avoid giving, lignocaine or bupivacaine in the epidural. Why am I avoiding local anesthetics? Because it's got other side effects, right? It can be hypotension, there can be sympathetic. Basically, the sympatholysis can occur. So that's why I'm trying to avoid it. And I will prefer to use opioids. Okay. Then, again, early ambulation, what is the benefit of that? That you can prevent deep vein thrombosis. Why is this patient again more prone for deep vein thrombosis? I already told you his blood is so thick because of the raised hematocrit. You will see the hematocrit in the pre-op itself, in the CBC report. That is when you should start thinking about DVT in the post-op. As an anesthetist, we have to think ahead. So we already know hematocrit is more. We know blood viscosity is more. We know this patient is prone for DVT. We know we have to mobilize him early. And we have to take steps to prevent DVT. All right. Then, now suppose this patient, how will you know that, I don't want to extubate this patient? I will continue to keep him. I will electively ventilate this patient after GE. So when am I going to decide that? So what's going to make me? So remember FEV1 by FVC ratio, which we saw in spirometry. If that ratio, I told you less than 0.7 means COPD. If it is less than 0.5, that means that this patient, this patient might go on the ventilator after surgery. All right. The other thing, if the PaCO2 is very high, so PaCO2 is more than 50 mmHg, PaCO2 more than 50 mmHg, FeV1 by FVC ratio less than 0.5, most probably a patient is going to land up on the ventilator post-operative. Now he's gone on the ventilator post-operative. What are your ventilator settings going to be like? Okay, what is your aim? So your aim is that your FiO2, how much should you keep? Your FiO2 should be based upon your PaO2 target. What is your target PaO2 in these patients? 60 to 100 mmHg. That is your target. According to that, you titrate the FiO2. You don't have to give every patient 100% FiO2. You keep the FiO2 based on the PaO2. How much you're getting, you have to see it on the ABC. Then what you will ask me, okay, so what should I, other settings, like how much, PAs, I am seeing the PaO2. What about my PaCO2? What should be my target over there? So your PaCO2 should be such that your pH is normal. Your PaCO2 values can be anything, no specific value defined, but at the same time, your pH has to be normal between 7.35 to 7.45. That is your target. So your target is 7.35 to 7.45. Your target is PaO2 60 to 100. And that is how you're going to adjust. All right. Important again, COPD patient respiratory rate and inspired expired ratio. Either you're setting the respiratory rate or setting the IE ratio, right? So when you're doing that, ensure that there's adequate time for expiration to occur. Okay. We again don't want air trapping. We don't want autopip to generate in the ICU. Okay. So this is it. This is what we are supposed to take care of.